All right, guys, last video on our formed elements talking about leukocyte characteristics. So they defend against pathogens. They actually have a nucleus in comparison to the erythrocytes who don't, and organelles, but they don't have any hemoglobin. So those are some differences between the leukocytes and erythrocytes. They're motile and flexible. Most are not in blood, but are actually in the tissues. So we have the diapedesis, which is a process of squeezing through blood vessel walls to go ahead and get into the blood, and then chemotaxis, which is the attraction of leukocytes to chemicals at an infection site. So whereas they're hanging out in the tissues, they have a couple ways of being called into the blood. So here are some examples for us: our neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and you can see the different shapes and what they look like underneath the microscope. So we've got our lymphocyte, our neutrophil, the eosinophil, the basophil, and then the monocyte. So the two leukocyte types that we have are granulocytes, which have visible granules when seen with a light microscope. So those are our neutrophils, our eosinophils, and our basophils. And then we have our agranulocytes, which are going to have smaller granules that are not visible with a light microscope. So those are going to be our lymphocytes and monocytes. So neutrophils are the most numerous leukocyte in the blood. They're multi-lobed. Their cytoplasm has pale granules when stained, and it enters tissue spaces and phagocytizes infectious pathogens. So the numbers are going to rise dramatically when you have a chronic bacterial infection. Eosinophils make up 1 to 4% of leukocytes. Their bilobed nucleus is connected by thin strand, and the cytoplasm has reddish granules. They phagocytize antigen antibody complexes or allergens, and they're active in cases of parasitic worm infection. Then we have our basophils, which are 0.5 to 1% of leukocytes. They are a bilobed nucleus, and the cytoplasm has blue-violet granules with histamine and heparin. So histamine release is causes an increase in blood vessel diameter and capillary permeability, which is a classic allergy symptom. And then heparin releases, it helps to inhibit blood clotting. So again, a lot of flushing of the skin and those kind of things. So when you have an allergic reaction, your skin's going to turn red, partially because of histamine and heparin. All right, our agranulocytes. Starting with our lymphocytes, they're going to reside in our lymphatic organs and structures, and they make up 20 to 40% of blood leukocytes. They have a dark staining round nucleus, and there are 3 categories: your T lymphocytes, your B lymphocytes, and your NK cells, or your natural killer cells. So T lymphocytes are going to manage immune response. B lymphocytes are going to become plasma cells and produce antibodies, and then NK cells are attacking abnormal and infected tissue cells. So our last agranulocyte is the monocytes. They have a C-shaped nucleus, and they make up 2 to 8% of blood leukocytes, and they take up residence in tissues. So they transform into large phagocytic cells, or macrophages, and they phagocytize bacteria, viruses, and debris. So differential count and changes in leukocyte profiles. So leukopenia is a reduced number of leukocytes. It increases your risk of infection. Leukocytosis is elevated leukocyte count, which may be caused by recent infection or stress. And then we have our differential count. So this measures the amount of each type of leukocyte and whether any are immature, and it's useful for clinical diagnosis. So neutrophilia is another increase in neutrophils. It's associated with bacterial infections, stress, tissue necrosis, or tissue death. Left-shifted differential is immature neutrophils in the circulation, and it's named for the way lab results were printed. Neutropenia is a decreased neutrophil count, which may occur with anemia, drug, or radiation therapies. Lymphocytosis is an increase in lymphocytes, which is caused by viral infections such as mumps or mononucleosis. It's also caused by chronic bacterial infections, some leukemias, and multiple myeloma. Decreases in lymphocyte count occur when you have HIV, other leukemias, and sepsis. Eosinophil numbers are going to rise during allergic reactions, parasitic infections, and some autoimmune diseases. Monocyte count can change as well, and it increases in response to chronic inflammatory disorders or tuberculosis, and decreases in response to prolonged prednisone therapy, which is just a drug. Basophil count can change as well, increases in response to myeloproliferative disorders or overproduction in bone marrow, decreases in response to acute allergic and stress reactions. So a clinical view for us about leukemia. This is malignancy in leukocyte-forming cells, so cancer in the leukocyte-forming cells. It's an abnormal development and proliferation of leukocytes, so they're going to increase in abnormal leukocyte number or decrease in erythrocyte and megakaryocytic lines. So this results in anemia and bleeding because you have less red blood cells and less platelets, but more leukocytes. So acute leukemia is rapid progression. Death typically happens within months for children and in young adults. Chronic leukemia is a slower progression, and in middle-aged and older individuals is typically where it's found. So talking about platelets or thrombocytes, they're small membrane enclosed cell fragments with no nucleus. They break off of megakaryocytes and red marrow, and they're important in the role of blood clotting. Normally you have 150,000 to 400,000 per cubic millimeter of blood, which is a lot, right? 30% is also stored in the spleen, and they circulate for 8 to 10 days and then are broken down and recycled. So they have a much smaller lifespan, if they can have a lifespan, since they're just pieces of a cell. And then just kind of going over what we learned in this little lecture here. So where does hemopoiesis occur? It's going to happen in specific bones that have red bone marrow. For example, the femur, the humerus, and the coxa, the os coxa. How does a reticulocyte differ from a fully mature erythrocyte? So remember, the reticulocyte is right before the mature erythrocyte. It's going to lack organelles, except for it's going to have more of those ribosomes to make the protein hemoglobin. And then how might an endurance athlete benefit from training at high altitude? It stimulates erythropoietin, or EPO, the hormone which controls erythropoiesis, and thus this increases blood's oxygen carrying capacity and viscosity. So what causes lymphocytosis? It's caused by viral infections, chronic bacterial infections, leukemia, and multiple myeloma. And which type of leukocyte decreases histamine release when someone takes an antihistamine? That's going to be our basophils. And then what types of antibodies are found in the plasma of someone with type B blood? That's going to be anti-A antibodies in their plasma.